Hey guys, we're back with another demo. This time it's for a weapon concept, and this one was for my first year art students at George Brown. And the example was to develop a gun concept based on the M16 semi-auto rifle with the following procedure. As usual, I provide some background information and backstory just to give us a little more personality and direction. A futuristic setting where Earth's resources are depleting, technology is very utilitarian as a result. The government faction on strict patrol and observation to protect the remaining resources. A resistance group distrusts the government and believes they are holding the resources for their own purposes at the expense of the suffering lower class. The look of the weapons would reflect either side of the conflict, and envision this for a FPS or third-person action shooter on next-gen console and PC. Some of the design inspirations from movies and games, such as Equilibrium, Army of Two, Homefront, and the Colonial Marines from James Cameron's Aliens, and the art direction to be inspired by Borderlands and Bulletstorm. Going back to specifically the Marines and Aliens, James Cameron's approach is always very utilitarian, meaning their guns are no nonsense, no frills, very straight, boxy, and straight and to the point. So that's kind of the approach we're going to do here. So let's get to the demo. So the first thing I did was pull up a reference image of an M16, and based on that I did a quick silhouette and as a template, again mainly focusing on the proportions and silhouette of an M16, which makes it stand out. And once I have that general silhouette, I close the reference image, and I use this as just a very rough base template. Again, it's just as a jump off point when I start to experiment with designs. So here we go, and I'm going to repeat the image a number of times to make a template of 6. Now this entire demo was about an hour in real time. This first portion, which was the first pass on the thumbnails, took about half an hour. And so essentially that was 5 minutes per thumbnail. And as usual, some took a little longer, some took shorter, but you get the general time and the speed. And so here you see again, similar to the character demos, as I'm experimenting with shapes, very random, not really thinking too much about it, but reacting to the shapes. But certainly I'm being very intentional about where I place them. So when I make a shape, I probably knew going in that I was going to put it on the barrel or on the handle or something like that, but the shape itself was pretty random. So here we're going on to the second thumbnail. Again, it's a random shape there, providing an interesting design element and attaching it to the design of that particular thumbnail. Again, doing kind of a cutout technique where I erase some lines here and there, add some just hint at some design details just to get the general idea, but nothing too fleshed out. As always, because this is a first pass, and with thumbnails, the most important thing is the silhouette and the shape. Here we go, another variation there. And again, using a lot of shortcuts to speed up time, or speed up the process rather. And the lasso, scaling and distorting and rotating where necessary. And some of these guns will look a little closer to an M16 and some deviate, and some may be even a little too over the top compared to our original direction of being more utilitarian. But that doesn't mean that we can't take some of the design elements or aspects from certain thumbnails, like I've shown you in the past, and pick and choose what works, and as we proceed to a revised design pass. And again, we're working with the profile view as opposed to a 3/4 or anything like that. Especially with weapons, you see that most common whenever you look at various gun concepts. And that's because there's a lot of information that can be shown just with a profile shot, and yet it's so quick and easy to do as compared to trying to do everything in perspective. Here we have the fifth thumbnail. I think this one in particular starts to probably deviate the most from the M16. This stage, of course, is always the most fun though, because this is where you can really kind of have flexibility to deviate a little more than compared to the later stages. Just it's a lot like brainstorming ideas, whether it's for a game or a story. Sometimes the most ludicrous ideas come to mind, and they may even be said in it as a joke, but that still can we can still find merit in that, and that could still trigger other ideas that are very viable down the line. And the same applies to drawing and designing. You may come up with something that seems a little too far from the original purpose, but again, it may introduce some other ideas and trigger some other ideas that could be used later on. Again, just cutting away implied details. So this would be iteration F. That looked like an alien hand, but that certainly wasn't the intention. And as you see me distort it and alter it, you'll see how I end up using it right there. You wouldn't have known that that looked like an alien hand before. So rounding out this last thumbnail. And actually this last iteration did have a lot going on there, and it's probably too much. But again, we'll end up taking some things from that that will work down the line as we revise the design pass. Trying to figure out where to place that. Okay, and as always, put on a template for presentation and letter them A to F, so the art director or client knows which one to refer to when getting feedback. Again, the stage of the asset you see in the middle there, thumbnails A to F, the name of the asset on the left, and the date and name of the artist on the right. Okay, so here we go in. The fictional art director is circling what he likes, various parts from the different iterations here. And I'm going to Frankenstein those as a quick pass for a new template. Selecting the scope on D, part of the barrel on F. Again, this speeds up the process, and fill it in a bit. So now I have a new template, and I'm going to duplicate that a couple times, narrowing down the iteration just to have a little more concentrated design pass instead of doing another 6, because I already explored those in the earlier ones. And here I go tweaking and erasing and adding. And so if the first thumbnail pass took half hour, this pass took about 15 minutes, and it was quick because we already had a narrower and more refined design pass with this template, because we started off with something that was very loose and based on an M16, and here this new template is based on those 6 iterations that we saw, picking and choosing elements that we liked. And within that 15 minutes, 1 or 2 of these took more effort than the others. I think the second one is the one that ends up being the simplest, and most of the work is applied to maybe the last one. Can't quite remember. Again, adding, subtracting. Not unlike how a sculptor works his clay. Sometimes he adds clay, sometimes he scrapes it off. One thing I mentioned to my students, and I'll mention here, is work really big, and most concept artists do. They work a very large size, dimensions and resolution. I think this was like 5100 by 3300 or something like that at 300 dpi. And the reason for that is, well, for print reasons, that's usually the case, because just in case you need to have artwork a certain size, it's always better to work big because you can always shrink it. But if you work small and try to scale it up, the resolution gets too pixelated. But in this case, it's more about tightening the concept. concept art is meant for production purposes. It's never meant to be a final or for promotion usually. And so the reason we work large is because even if you do a line that's kind of wobbly, if you work at a big size and high resolution, when you shrink that down, that line straightens up. So the same thing applies here. I'm working very loose and rough at a large scale, but the way the art gets submitted is usually a much smaller resolution because you don't need it that big when you're reviewing it. And as a result, these images get a lot tighter and a lot cleaner. If any of you look at speed paintings, it's the same idea. When you look at an environment that was done as a speed paint, you get the idea across. You can even feel all the detail and the shading and the colors in, say, a landscape. But when you zoom in, you notice that the artist worked very loosely and with very rough brush strokes. That's because it was never meant to be looked at zoomed in. And so it's the same idea here. Work large, work loose, and then when it's done, you shrink it down and submit it as a lower resolution, and that makes the ideas crystallize and become a lot cleaner. So there you see that revised pass, and now the art director is saying he overall likes the middle one and part of the handle and barrel on the third one, and totally ruled out the first one. And here we're getting down to an even more refined pass. And so at this stage, clean it up a little more and add a little more detail, a little bit more revision even, but not deviating too much. And that one was picked again because going back to the original information, the weapon had to be it couldn't be too out there, it couldn't be too frivolous, or this had to be utilitarian and a little more straightforward and a little more purposeful. And so that's why this one was chosen. But of course, because it's sci-fi and it's for entertainment, you still have to have a certain cool factor to it. It still has to look appealing. And lastly, I add a little more information by adding some more highlights and maybe a little more hinted detail and cutouts into the design. But they're still pretty loose and they're still pretty general. Later on, if this goes to final, then yes, we can go in and actually flesh out every little detail and every little section. But just adding these little extra highlights and little extra details takes a little further, providing enough information that you can get the idea across while still being very fast and not too time involving, because again, the details are fairly general. And this is still all black and white. So something like that, where you see a bit of a highlight there, is enough information to tell the viewer, oh, that's probably indented because of that bezel that I see there. Maybe those are lights or something. So the reader, the viewer, is filling in the gaps and getting the idea across. This final step took 15 minutes. So again, the total time was an hour working on this. And going back to just comparing your efficiency in an 8-hour day, if you kept doing weapons, again, you get some idea of how fast you can pump these out. Theoretically, if it's the same time, then it would be 48 thumbnails and 24 revised passes and 8 that are at a more revised sketch pass like this. So that would be pretty productive. So one thing I'm doing there is I duplicated all the artwork that was done there and I'm masking it out and I made it brighter. And this is one way to, and now I'm revealing the mask with gradients. And what that does is that allows me to add highlights and things like that without worrying about painting outside the silhouette, because I'm using the same artwork duplicated and just set brighter. So again, some blooms here just to separate some of the parts a bit, add a little bit of depth and dimension to it. And then again, putting it on the template. and the stage. Again, now it's revision 1, so it's getting towards a more detailed, refined pass. Name, date, stage. And there are the steps again, starting off the first thumbnails, the revised thumbnails, and then the revised sketch. So there you have it. Take care, guys. Bye.